Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how's it going today?
It is going fantastic today, Tim. Thank you so much for asking. I hope all the listeners are doing fantastic as well. I love bringing on new guests to the show who become friends, and I love when old friends of the show come back on with a new project and introduce us to new friends, and that's what we have here today. We got two guests on who are Peabody award-winning journalists. They won a Peabody Award, or is it Peabody? I know the town in Massachusetts is Peabody, but I'm pretty sure the award is Peabody. So they are recipients of those awards. But Tim, I want to be a recipient of the award of knowing how you're doing today.
I am doing great over here. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, very excited to speak with Trevor Aaronson and Ellie Knight, two incredible journalists who worked on this story called Into the Madness. And it is out, it's an Audible original. The subtitle is A Killer's Game, A Woman's Obsession, A Dark Conspiracy. And it really delivers on all those aspects, Lance. And this is about the mass shooting that took place on 4th of July, 2022 in Highland Park, Illinois, when Bobby Crimo opened fire on a crowd of people and killed 7 and injured many others. And this story is really compelling, Lance, told by Trevor Aaronson, who narrates the show, and he is just a fantastic journalist.
Right, and him and Ellie work so great together. I love how they were able to complement each other in answering our questions and kind of guiding us through the story from multiple perspectives. I really love the fact that this story, while I think we say it in the episode as well, we always want to make sure that we keep the victims at the forefront of this story. But, you know, sometimes those victims aren't ready to be a part of a storytelling experience like this. And Trevor and Ellie really honed in on the person who perpetrated this and opened up all of these things, all of these Pandora boxes of conspiracy theories, alternative universes, fake universes, nihilism, role-playing games. So the importance of this is to figure out, or to do our best with wrapping our heads around, why someone takes that AR-15 and goes to that location and starts opening fire. We do, in so many other circumstances, talk about victims, and they should not be forgotten about, but I appreciate the refreshing approach of saying, why did this 19, 20-year-old kid become what he became? And why did he do what he did? Because that's another part of the puzzle that we need to put into place in order to figure out one of the thousands of reasons why a human's brain will do something like this.
Well, it keeps happening, Lance.
Yep.
So, you know, and obviously they're all unique. But I mean, I think that goes to show we need to find out why they're happening. So Trevor and Ellie certainly dig into this, and they've got another show out from Audible as well called Pulse. And we're actually going to speak with them again to discuss that story very soon. So definitely check out Into the Madness. It is excellent.
It is excellent, and you just mentioned Pulse. That is the Peabody Award-winning piece of journalism that they did.
Really interesting show. Definitely check it out. And while you're out there, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. And hey, we're a video show on Spotify. If you're listening on a different podcatcher that doesn't include video, you may want to switch over to Spotify and check us out on video.
Check us out and check our guests out. Sometimes you can get a lot by watching the reaction and the expressions and the emotions that people go through when they tell their stories on this show. And Tim, we're going to be telling a story in Denver, Colorado, September 5th, 6th, and 7th. And we're going to be joined by a very distinguished individual, very handsome individual. And if folks want to see us in person there, they can get 10% off their standard badge by going to crimecon.com. Using code Crawlspace for 10% off your standard badge. Tim, I mentioned this distinguished, handsome individual. It's not your dad, but it's close.
Yes, it's Joseph Scott Morgan from the show Body Bags, and he is a really distinguished death investigator, and we're going to be speaking with him about the story of the New England serial killer, and it is going to be fascinating. I think it's at 2 p.m. local time on Sunday at CrimeCon, so we will see you there.
All right, so we're going to break real quick for commercial. We'll be right back with our guests, Trevor Aaronson and Ellie Knight. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the show, Trevor Aaronson, and welcome to the show, Ellie Knight. How are you both doing today?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you both.
It's incredible to meet you as well. The work that you've done here is really frightening, and it's really eye-opening, and there's a lot of insightful moments that we can take from this incredible piece of work that you've done. But before we get into all of that, do both of you mind just introducing yourself to the audience? Let them know a little bit about yourselves.
Sure, I can start. My name is Trevor Aaronson. I'm a journalist. I've been covering, the FBI in particular for a very long time. And my brief background is I started in magazine journalism and then slowly progressed over to more documentary work, like documentary podcasts, like we're about to talk about today. And I guess about 4 years ago, I started working with Ellie.
Yeah, so I'm Ellie. I started working with Trevor about 4 years ago when I was in my undergraduate or graduate program, actually. I found him online, actually. I was really interested in the work that he was doing, and I needed to do a practicum research for the master's. I was getting my master's in data analytics and criminal justice. So found Trevor online. I was like, hey, would love to work with you. And got an email back, really like by the luck of everything. And then from that, it progressed into a position in documentary podcasts, something I never thought I would do, but now I'm like absolutely obsessed with, could never imagine myself doing anything else, really.
Yeah, that's really cool. One of the questions that we always ask people who have gone into journalism, and Trevor, you said that you started in print journalism and now you do the podcast long form journalism. Same with you, Ellie. And you just said that you would never go back. Like, this is what you seemingly, have found in your wheelhouse, right? Like this podcast storytelling journalism.
Yeah, it's a fun ride, honestly. It's something that feeds my brain. I really, really enjoy it.
You're simultaneously feeding other people's brains too. I mean, you literally have a direct path through their ears with their earbuds, with your story. What is it about that resonates? Is it the fact that they hear your voice? Like, what do you guys think it is about that resonates a little bit deeper than a traditional print journalism piece?
So I guess I would say, it's definitely the intimacy, right? Like there's on a couple levels. I mean, I think one of the reasons I really fell in love with, audio documentaries is that it has a lot of the strengths that, long form written journalism has, that, you have the space and the time to tell the story, but it's able to communicate things that are very difficult, if not impossible, to communicate in writing. Like sometimes what's really powerful in an audio documentary is like silence, and that moment of silence that you just like really can't translate into writing in the same way. It's the way someone says a word in their voice that is, not something that's easily communicated and has this kind of like level of communication on an emotional level that's really difficult to transfer in writing. And so for me, I really view audio documentaries as a way of, writing similar types of stories, but it has this capacity that just doesn't exist in more traditional writing that I think is amazing and allows you to tell stories in a different way, and also allows you to tell stories that are powerful in ways that might only be powerful in, kind of an audio form. Like this story, Into the Madness, as an example, I think wouldn't translate as well as a written piece as it does as a form of audio storytelling.
Yeah, and I would second that, definitely, like what Trevor's saying. Something I've learned since working with him is what translates well into magazine pieces and what translates well into audio. And something that's I've really seen is audio allows the person who the subject is to tell their story. Like it physically gives them a voice that written words don't. They are able to get on the mic and share their actual experience and connect with an audience and other people in society that can physically feel the way that they're feeling. It touches humanity, I think, in just a way deeper level than sometimes writing can do.
Yeah, very much agreed on that. Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
Sorry, I keep interrupting.
I'm just excited.
Definitely agree with your answers there. Really great stuff. You mentioned Into the Madness. Can you tell us a little bit about this story and why this story?
So Ellie and I had previously worked on a series for Audible called Pulse: The Untold Story, which was a story about the Pulse nightclub shooting, the story of a mass shooting. It intrigued our interest in a number of ways on the topic writ large. And while I was writing that story, this woman, Jamie, had come to me, and the reasons for it were a little convoluted. It was that I had written a lot about FBI sting operations, And she had been communicating with this man in prison or in jail, Bobby Crimo, who'd been accused of committing a mass shooting during a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois. And he had put forward this kind of conspiracy theory that he had been kind of seduced into doing it by the FBI and that the FBI was somehow responsible. I pretty quickly realized that that wasn't true. But I guess what was intriguing to me was it opened this window into being able to explore how, conspiracy theories have kind of like percolated through our society at large, and that mass shootings in particular have been, kind of a subject of various, conspiracy theories. And what was kind of most striking and what kind of made me realize that there was something here as an audio story was that she had provided me hours and hours of these recordings that she had made of Bobby Crimo talking to him in lockup. And, it was just this kind of very intimate and strange relationship. And then Jamie herself, which, getting back to this idea of like how audio storytelling can be unique, I thought Jamie herself had this presence in the audio that was unique, that she had this voice that was, in some ways interesting. She was a good storyteller. And I realized that there was this story behind this story, that this wasn't the story about the FBI being, part of this mass shooting, which was not true. The real story was the story of this relationship between this woman and this mass shooter, and what that ultimately revealed about kind of conspiracy theories and the society we live in today.
What's the difference in your opinions when a conspiracy theory stops becoming innocent, coming up with crazy scenarios, and it's harmless? Are there any warning signs after you've worked on these projects that you've seen? Like, is there a tipping point when someone has a conspiracy theory and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is too much now? Because I have theories, but I don't take them as far.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that drew me into this show so much was I think all of us as humans have this innate desire to derive meaning from things, especially events that we can't explain, such as a mass shooting. This is something that's so horrific and happens in our society. It's just disgustingly dark. When we don't have a direct answer for that, we have this need, I think all of us really do, to figure out, well, why did that happen? And around us, we see people trying to construct those narratives or really just doing their own due diligence to research and figure things out. But sometimes from that, conspiracies can be born because something may look like something, and then it easily can pick up traction or speed on social media. And then before you know it, it's blown up into this whole theory, and the event itself, the facts of it have been forgotten in the past. And now what lays behind is this conspiracy. And I think that's what's really interesting in this story, was to dive into that with Jamie side by side and like really pick apart how a conspiracy is born and bred and just grows and transforms. And how can you even get back to the truth after you're in the madness, so. Well
done working the title in.
Thank you. Yeah. I was hoping you guys would notice.
I would say too, I think one of the things that I find really interesting about being able to do long form stories like this is that there's this opportunity to kind of mire in the gray in a way that you can't in kind of shorter form stories. And I think a goal of my work in general is really wanting to present stories that are nuanced and ambiguous. And that's often how I think life really is. The allure of conspiracy theories is it allows you to take, the complexities of life and boil them down into simple stories. And I think people find that really alluring. I also think it's incredibly dangerous, right? And we can see that happening in our society at large. A large portion of society believes that the FBI was behind January 6th. That's just like one example of a conspiracy theory that kind of gains this kind of truth. And I think, the more we live in the society where it's more and more difficult to discern truth from conspiracy, where we have a kind of a media environment that is packaging things in kind of easily digestible sizes, I think creates this situation where, these conspiracy theories really kind of spread very easily and warp society's understanding of truth in really dangerous ways. And so, the story I think we tried to tell in Into the Madness was as much about the story itself, but really kind of using that as a microcosm to understand how these conspiracies happen all over the place.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about Jamie? How did she sort of come to know Bobby, and how did she, I guess, come to believe this conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure Ellie would have a fair amount to add to this as well. I should say that, we presented Jamie's story as very much an unreliable narrator. And that was intentional because parts of her story were just impossible to corroborate. And so we wanted the story to be kind of told through her perspective. And so her perspective, the story she tells is that, she was very into SoundCloud rap. Bobby Cremo, prior to the shooting, was a SoundCloud rapper who went by the stage name Awake the Rapper, and that he was coming through her small town in Indiana. She attended the show, and that's where she met him. And over time, sporadically, they communicated through Instagram and Snapchat. And then the shooting happens, and she sees the video of Bobby in the back of the police cruiser having been arrested, and realizes this is the young man she met at this club a few years prior. And she reaches out to him in jail, and then they begin this conversation. And through that conversation, these recordings begin. By the time she reaches out to me, she had dozens of hours of recordings between them. Jamie had assumed that Bobby was incapable of having committed the shooting. The reasons for that, I think are a mixture of kind of conspiratorial thinking and, an affection, even love she had developed for Bobby. And so, over time, she becomes kind of this advocate and, ends up kind of getting admired in, a mixture of kind of the conspiracy thinking that went on immediately after the shooting. After the shooting, there were a number of internet sleuths who had come up with theories that, were kind of unmoored from reality about what was possibly the truth behind the shooting. And then Jamie kind of gets mixed up with those, as well as, Bobby's own manipulation about what happened, leading ultimately to her recording a video of him from jail describing how the shooting was an FBI false flag operation, and then posting that online. And I guess that was kind of part of why we found Jamie so fascinating, was that, she was not only this kind of, confessional for Bobby, this person that he talked to, but kind of became an active, unwitting participant in this larger conspiracy, that Bobby was trying to construct.
Going off of what you just said, Trevor, it demonstrates how easily, I guess, or susceptible we all can be to conspiracies in that way. And especially when emotion is involved, or the conspiracy is attractive to you from your background, the way you grew up, or your belief system, it may be more enticing to believe the conspiracy rather than believe truth. And then it's really easy to lose sight of what really happened and what the facts are. But one of the major parts of this project was listening to the 48 hours of phone calls between Bobby and Jamie. So Jamie provided those calls, the jailhouse calls between the two of them. And that was something that I got to do, was sit down and listen to these hour-long calls. It took up a long time to sit down and really listen to them, but I got to know their relationship in a really intimate way that it was a privilege to hear two people. It's like intimate conversations between two people, two humans. Despite what he did, it was really interesting to see what they would talk about, or I guess how the conspiracy grew, or their belief system. And a lot of the themes that we were working on or studying in this project were what they would talk about. There were a lot of conspiracy conversation. There was a lot of conversation about society and just dark nihilistic thoughts. And all of that seemed to overlap with also what we were looking at. So it was really complementary to the greater theme that we were exploring here.
Were you ever nervous going through those calls, listening to them, that you might start to fall in line with some of these ways of thinking? Because I would start to get paranoid if I was listening to hours of conversation. I'd be, am I coming out the other side like a believer here? Or, did that happen?
Yeah, thankfully I had Trevor to keep me grounded. I think that's the most important thing in one of these projects, is you have to have really good communication with someone as you're going through it. Because I think, if you're working on it alone, it can be easy to get lost in all of the different things that are going on, because there's so much here. And like I said, this is something that we see right now in society. It's something that's going on in social media and in the news. And really, you ask your neighbors, most people believe in some sort of conspiracy one way or another. It's really easy to fall in line with that. So I think having someone to discuss those facts with really can help keep you grounded. But the paranoia level, I'm not going to lie, that did get me a little bit. There were times I'd be listening to my headphones, kind of looking over my shoulder, because the conversations were so intimate. And I felt like I was sitting and listening there. I thought I was really listening in on someone's conversation, which I kind of was. But still, it was just incredibly intimate that it does give you a bit of paranoia.
And Bobby kind of played into this conspiracy quite a bit. A really fascinating part of the podcast was when you were speaking about this ARG that he created, or alternate reality game. Can you tell us about this and how he used this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that realizing that Bobby was at least trying to create this alternate reality game was a big part of why I saw this as an Audible series, because it gave this really interesting context to what was happening. And so alternate reality games are these games that exist online, and it's basically like an online scavenger hunt. And they're very sophisticated games, very simple ones. And it asks players to go out and solve a puzzle. And that can be like going to websites and finding clues, and those clues lead you to other places. And there are examples of this, happening in like books that exist in a text, but then the text sends you to other places. And so this idea of an alternate reality game is something that's fairly nebulous, but on the whole, it's kind of like a scavenger hunt, essentially. And what Bobby had done was create a series of videos that were like basically music videos from a SoundCloud rap. And in those videos were nested all sorts of what could be considered clues, like visuals that were linked to other videos. And what Jamie, as well as some online sleuths, had done was come to the conclusion, which I believe was accurate, that Bobby was trying to create this puzzle, this alternate reality game that would then lead people to some sort of conclusion. So typically what happens at an alternate reality game is once you solve the puzzle, there's some sort of Easter egg, some sort of prize, whatever it is, a message. And what they had believed that there was a series of videos that if you could figure out what those clues meant, it would allow you to unlock this book that he had published, self-published on Amazon, called Arcturus, that was just a bunch of numbers. It was a cipher. And that somehow, if you could put this puzzle together, you would be able to unlock this message that Bobby had nested through these numbers in this book. What Jamie believed, what a few others, seem to speculate online, was that book, Arcturus, was some sort of answer to why the mass shooting happened. And if you were kind of to take this conspiracy theory to its limits, that in the way Jamie did, it's the belief that somehow the FBI was behind it, and that this book would then, once kind of solved, would have that message and show you what was really happening. Clearly a flaw in that argument, as we point out, is if that's true, if there was this grand conspiracy that Bobby was somehow innocent or other people were involved, it would benefit him greatly just to be like, hey guys, here's how you solve the puzzle. I didn't actually do this mass shooting. But he didn't do that. And so he tried to kind of preserve this. And so, one theory, and this is never anything that Bobby has explicitly said in the phone calls with Jamie. He's kind of coy about, what this is. He's at times like, pushes Jamie to try to solve the puzzle rather than giving her more direct clues. And, our assumption, and I think what we tried to communicate, was that like the idea, we believe, is that Bobby either tried to create this ARG and really wasn't smart enough to create it in a way that people could solve it, right? Because a challenge of ARGs is that you want to create a puzzle, but you need to create it in such a way that an average person or an intelligence person is able to solve it. And if, and that's a challenge in itself. So maybe, he just lacked that ability, or, this was something that was never solvable. And the real purpose of the mass shooting was to draw attention to this in this very nihilistic way, to try to get people to play this kind of, dastardly game that really has no end.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So we've talked about Bobby and we've talked about Highland Park, but we haven't actually talked about the shooting itself. And I just want to give some context for the listeners. Can you just take us to that day, to the shooting, and what was done and what he perpetrated?
So every year, Highland Park, it's an affluent suburb in Chicago. It has a very large Jewish population. They host a 4th of July parade. And it's one of the big deals of the city. Bobby had that morning dressed as a woman in a dress and gone up to a rooftop above a cosmetic store that was right on Main Street. And as the parade is starting, He then takes his AR-15 and opens fire on the crowd. And dozens were injured. I believe 7 were killed. It was a horrific mass shooting for all the reasons that mass shootings are horrific. What was particularly disturbing about it, as we describe in the series, is that, it happened at a point in a 4th of July parade where people at first confused the gunfire with fireworks, sounds of the parade. And so a number of people were killed before kind of the panic set in and everyone realized that this was happening. The story of the shooting itself is obviously just horrific. And it's kind of like, it's a challenge with stories like this because, one of the things that I think was interesting for me is that, we've reached this point, mass shootings happen so often that we kind of lose sight of them and forget them. And so describing how horrific they are, it just seems like a story that we tell over and over again. And the reason that this story in particular was different from the Pulse shooting series that Ellie and I had done is that everyone remembered Pulse. It was one of these landmark cases that people remembered. And it was after Pulse that mass shootings just became more and more common, that they start to run together in your mind. And this was one of those stories. And so it was an interesting way for us to tell the story of this mass shooting that happened, that everyone would remember the 48 hours after it happened. And then it just kind of bleeds into the memories of other mass shootings. And I don't mean that to be dismissive of the horror of these crimes. It's more just to acknowledge the reality that these happen so frequently.
So how did Bobby get radicalized to this point?
This is one of the stories, and to get back into the conspiracy theory culture we were talking about, and this is related. Bobby had, during the pandemic, really just, like a lot of Americans, just withdrawn inward, right? Just like spent a lot of time online. Bobby in particular was laid off from his job as a result of the pandemic. As his family describes, he was then eligible for unemployment benefits from Illinois, which at the time were quite generous. So there just wasn't a lot of incentive for him to go back to work. He wasn't in school any longer. And so he just spent a lot of time online. The popular theory about his radicalization, when you talk to people or when people online had looked at this and speculated, was that he had spent a lot of time on this website called Documenting Reality, which was a gore site. There was a barrier to entry. You had to pay a nominal fee. I think it was about $20 through cryptocurrency to join this website. And this website allowed people to share all sorts of like really, really horrific videos of people dying, car accidents, industrial accidents, that type of thing. The assumption was that Bobby had somehow been radicalized through this website. And what made the theory even more intriguing and contributed to the theory about the FBI was that the man who operated this site had operated a previous site that had been shut down by law enforcement years earlier. There was this kind of assumption that it was possible he was like operating this new site as a kind of honeypot where they would exchange videos and the FBI or other law enforcement agencies would be able to identify potential extremists through this website. The interesting thing I think I found in the reporting and what I tried to reflect in the storytelling, and I think this is emblematic of how conspiracy theories quickly fall apart and how I think kind of citizen journalists aren't really doing a good job, is that like one of the lessons I learned like really early in journalism is that when you go into a story, the assumptions that you make are often not true. Like you have the story and you come up with this assumption about like what possibly happened. And then you realize that like life is just really messy. And these clean theories that you come up with are often not the right ones. And what happens with conspiracy theories is that they never, and also like citizen journalists who kind of connect things they find online, they never take it to that next step where they go and they talk to the people directly involved. They go and chase the records that are there. And what you find is that the real story is actually quite different than the one that you had assumed. And this is almost universally true in my experience. And this was true in this story in that, ultimately what was strange was that this website that people thought was kind of so radicalizing to Bobby was actually this like, as dark as it was in the sense that these people were exchanging videos of people dying. It was actually this like community of kind of like listless men who didn't have another community, and they would get together on this Skype call and talk. And this call that Bobby had been invited into was always on. Like the culture of the call was that you kept the Skype call on. And, the theories that percolated online, including, those that Jamie subscribed to, was that this was some sort of like radicalizing event. People were pushing people toward violence, when in reality, it was a call where people who were lonely could just dial in and find someone to talk to. The exact ingredients of why Bobby turned out the way he did are still very much up for debate, I think. But the story that became the most prevalent, which is that there was this online radicalization, was not necessarily true. I mean, I think if anything was true about him, it's that like he had kind of ended up subscribing to this deep level of nihilism, and that it was possible that he was having trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy potentially. But I don't know that we'll ever fully know that answer, in that, that's not something Bobby, has ever wanted to really talk about publicly.
Yeah. And I think what's so difficult in cases like this is, like what Trevor is saying, it's not like there's one determining factor. It's probably just a accumulation of things. And none of us lived the life that he did through childhood. We don't know what he was exposed to when he was younger. We interviewed family members and spoke to people who were able to give accounts, and were able to see glimpses, but it's not like we can actually see what really happened. And like only Bobby knows that, he knows what happened in his head. I don't think it would be fair to say there was just one turning point in that, even though it would be great if we could say that, then we could narrow down like, how do we stop this sort of radicalization? But I don't think it's that simple, which is the harsh reality of what we have to deal with today in society. But I think it's definitely, there were a lot of factors that contributed to it. I think what also is hard is that his motive or motivation was not thoughtfully fully given in court because of the jinx he pulled on the victims with taking the plea deal, not taking the plea deal, going back and forth, and really putting them through that emotional hell there. So a lot of it is just a big question mark as we still stand.
Yeah, that's what frustrates me about these stories, especially the mass shooters, is because then it gets so politicized. Like we have to turn it into, we have to ban guns, and stronger regulations on guns. And then another side will say, well, it's not the guns, it's the mental health issues. But nothing's ever changed. Have we seen gigantic strides in improving people's mental health recently? No. I mean, it's not getting better, and the regulations on these types of weapons are not getting any more strict. I mean, people can still find a way to get these AR-15s or whatever. AR-15?
AR-15, yeah.
Oh, yeah. See, I don't even know.
I think one of the interesting things about Bobby's case on that line was that Bobby was a bit of a performance artist. Like, I think one of the things that I think we can assume correctly is that he really wanted attention, and he had acted in ways that you could see as there were symbols. For example, he'd attended Trump rallies and Stop the Steal rallies, dressed up as Where's Waldo. And after the shooting, Democrats in particular, people who advocated for stricter gun control laws, saw that as like, well, look at this guy. Here's another person who was radicalized to violence by Trump and MAGA. And then separately, Gateway Pundit, one of the right-wing conspiracy websites, had taken the symbols that Bobby used and compared them to anarchist symbols, and claimed that Bobby was a left-wing extremist, and that's why he committed violence. And what you're saying, I think, it's interesting because you could kind of see that directly in Bobby's case, where people took the evidence that they wanted to fit whatever narrative they preferred, right? That Bobby was a right-wing extremist, that Bobby was a left-wing extremist. And neither of those, from what Ellie and I could tell from our research, were true. I don't think Bobby was particularly right-wing or left-wing. I think he was, taking political symbols and kind of appropriating them in ways that he wanted to, for attention, for mental illness, for whatever the reason. I think that's the challenge with stories like this, and mass shootings in particular. And you see this in other areas like terrorism. I think there is this desire to believe that there is a process that someone is radicalized to commit this kind of violence, and it's always the same no matter who the defendant is, when in reality, humans are very complicated and they're driven by all sorts of different things. And I don't think there's necessarily a template that says, these are the warning signs for becoming a mass shooter or becoming a terrorist or whatever it might be. And I think that's something we want to fall back to. We want to believe that there is this simplistic formula that gives us warnings. And I think, it behooves federal law enforcement agencies in general to kind of come up with these theories, because it's very difficult to tell the public, we have no idea, anybody could become one of these, perpetrators of violence. And so it fits this narrative that we're doing something. We're looking for people who fit these patterns, these flags. But I think the if you look in particular where studies have been done on this in particular is kind of like the radicalization path for terrorism. None of these studies and these theories hold up to any kind of social science scrutiny. I mean, the truth is that humanity is very complicated. The world is very chaotic, and all sorts of people kind of are driven to violence for very different reasons.
Ellie, you were nodding pretty enthusiastically during that. Is there something that you want to add to that? Because there's so much gray in all of this,
Yeah, I think it is true. I think all of us, or at least society, it's easy to fit him into our buckets, like our political buckets of, okay, he's right wing, he's left wing. But what we really saw is there was just a deep level of nihilism. And something we talked about was this idea or aspect of doomerism, which is deep nihilism amongst, the younger generation. And a lot of that is from being inherently online. And something that was really interesting in this project was that, and what I heard in the jailhouse calls was that Bobby was really frustrated with the way society had taken a turn towards becoming very technologically driven. He couldn't stand social media. He couldn't stand TikTok in particular. And really what Gen Z and younger were doing, the way that they would take selfies, or he was highly, highly critical about people sharing their lives online and spending a lot of time online. But then on the other hand, what we saw from his digital footprint was that he also was online a lot. So it was like he couldn't escape this sort of thing that he was fighting so desperately. He had fallen victim to it too. So that was one of the things that we can say is we know that he was very anti-technology, deeply nihilistic, but also did fall victim to the same sort of pattern of things.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
It's so weird. It's weird for me to wrap my head around the concept of nihilism, which is essentially like you have no belief system. You believe that everything is sort of meaningless and one thing doesn't really lead to another thing. But when you are the perpetrator of a mass shooting, that's a gigantic event. That has meaning. That has repercussions. That's not meaningless. It's so hard for me to wrap my head around that. And if it was so meaningless to him, why didn't he just go out in a blaze of glory? Why didn't he get out of the car when he was pulled over and just start waving his weapon around if his life is meaningless?
I could try to answer that question, but I'd answer it with a caveat that this is tough because Bobby was a man of contradictions. And so, I guess I would say if I'm trying to answer that and I'm putting myself in Bobby's head, or at least trying to, as Ellie was saying, Bobby had almost this kind of Unabomber-like ideology where he was very anti-technology. And, one of the motifs we used was this idea of the allegory of Plato's cave, which, is this idea that there were these men in this cave and they're imprisoned there and there's a fire going and they begin to believe that the shadows on the wall are their reality because that's all they can see. They can't see outside the cave and the larger world outside. And Bobby had believed that our phones were kind of creating this Plato's cave for us, that like the world is this, we're living in this false reality that is being cast on our phone, and that there's this larger world out there to see that no one is awake to. And so when he's ultimately arrested, the FBI and a local detective interrogated him and they asked him why he did it. And he said kind of very cryptically to wake people up. I don't want to say this as definitive because it's just like, kind of speculation based on what we know. I think it's possible that Bobby could kind of live with this contradiction internally by thinking like the world itself that we're living in is meaningless because we're living in Plato's cave. We're living in this we're living in this false world, and we should see that world as a nihilistic one because it's really fake. And that there's this other world that if we can wake people up to, then things would be better. And again, that kind of fits largely in line with what, some of the Unabombers anti-technology manifesto from the 90s. To the extent that Bobby could live with those contradictions, that's how I try to explain it if I had to theorize about it.
What was the reaction from Bobby's parents to what he did?
Bobby's mother and his father are both included in the series. I think it's fair to say that this was a dysfunctional household and that Bobby was a bit of a latchkey kid. And I think, I suspect his father would disagree with this assessment to some degree, but that like Bobby was on his own for a lot. His parents, I think, weren't really paying a lot of attention to what he was doing. I think they were genuinely shocked at the shooting. I think that shock would have been less so if they were maybe paying a little bit more attention to what Bobby was doing, day to day. At the same time, as we show in the series, like, his mom has really acted in ways that suggest there might be kind of mental concerns. I think this was a household that was very tumultuous. And I think all of those things kind of contributed to the person Bobby was. That said, though, like, I think it's so challenging. I mean, I think, as a parent myself, like it's like, it's really challenging. You can't like say that the parents are responsible for everything your child does, because I think, all sorts of things contribute. But I think like for them, like they were just shocked by this. And I think that was because it was shocking, but also that they weren't quite paying attention to what Bobby was doing. Because I think there were signs that, not that he would commit a mass shooting. I think that was clearly surprising, but there were signs that he was kind of a very troubled young man.
So is that one of the takeaways from this? Hopefully someone can hear this and they can recognize some signs that one of their relatives, a loved one, might be exhibiting similar signs. And what do you do in that case? Do you try to do something preemptive, or because that just might make it worse, right? So it's such a tough situation to be in. Like, what do you do when a loved one is trying to figure out a way to buy an AR-15? Just because you're going to buy it doesn't mean that you're going to perpetrate a mass shooting. But are there other signs there that people can pick up on? Is that something that was intended so you can maybe stop the behavior pattern?
Bobby's father ended up pleading guilty to a criminal charge in helping him obtain a firearm owner's ID card. Illinois has a very specific law that requires, if you're under 21, that you have to have a parent kind of sign off on this ID card. And, many parents do that, right? I mean, whatever your opinions on guns are, like Bob Cremo wasn't the only one who did that for his son. And, the allegation, the criminal charge, and, gun rights advocates kind of found it troubling, is that, the prosecution alleged that he should have known. He should have known that his son was dangerous and that was happened. And the challenge, I think, I fear this is not going to be the most satisfying answer, is that I think that's a very difficult question to answer. Like Bobby's music videos were inherently violent, but that doesn't mean everyone who produces violent videos is going to commit acts of violence, right? Like there are, people who create horrific horror films and they're not violent people, right? And so I don't think you can necessarily connect those two. And I think this also gets at kind of the larger trouble that law enforcement has. There have been cases where, young men or young women have written down fantasies of school shootings, and that has caused parents and, school officials to kind of, investigate. And I think that's an appropriate response. Whether they would have actually committed that school shooting is something I think it's much more difficult to ascertain. And so I don't think this is an easy answer for both parents and law enforcement, just because I think there are, the signs that you see in hindsight, you often don't before the incident happens.
I think that kind of ties into what we were saying earlier, that there isn't this specific pattern for each case that we can follow. Like, I think there are telling points that are like, okay, that's a little sketchy. I think we should sit down and have a conversation. And so then in that case, I would just encourage, if you notice something like that, like frequenting dark websites or speaking about committing a violent act or any leaning into those sort of dark aesthetics, have a conversation with your kid. I think that please intervene, or school officials, like whatever you can do. But again, ultimately, we don't have this concrete formula to stop these things. All we can try to do is have the conversations ahead of time. And I guess if your red flags go up, then yeah, have that conversation.
And in your opinion, why is it so much more prevalent here in this country?
I think Democrats and the people on the left who advocate for stricter gun control would point out that we have much looser gun laws than most nations. I don't think that's the only reason. I mean, I think it goes deeper than that too. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. We are a nation with an incredibly violent history, and I don't think that is easily just washed away. And I think there's a unique number of social factors that are contributing to this. I also think it's a problem that has many causes. That's what makes it harder to kind of come up with a solution, but also then easier for people with political agendas to like make very simple solutions, right? Like curb gun laws or put up stricter gun laws, or let's do mental health counseling. And I think that, this is a very difficult question that isn't easily solved by policy alone. And so it's easy to just kind of throw your hands up and be like, I don't know, or we should just ban guns, or people should get, mental health counseling. And the truth is that this is like a problem that has been, plaguing us for years. One thing I'd add to that too is I think this story focuses on Bobby Crimo and his motivations. And I think some of the pushback that I've seen us get has been like, well, why did you give this man a platform, right? Like, why didn't you make this more about the victims? And the truth is that we tried to talk to a lot of the victims. For various reasons, they chose not to, including that there is pending litigation. And I understand the compulsion, right? Like, I understand that we should make this about, people who suffered and not people who perpetrated the crime. But I also think in going too far in that way, we get away from trying to explain why these people committed this act. And I think projects like this, they're not going to solve the problem of mass violence, but they're going to try to kind of explain what happened in one case in a very holistic way. And I think, it doesn't hurt to do more of that, to try to understand that this is a very complicated problem. And the truth is that there are so many mass shootings. I don't think there's enough study on like why they happen. And I think too much we've kind of fallen into these easy patterns of explaining, what should be done. And, again, not a satisfying answer. I can't solve the issue of gun violence, but I also think it's something that is a much more difficult and nuanced problem than we've given it credit for.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great answer. I think that identifying behavior patterns and focusing on someone who has committed these acts is important. And it is important, of course, to include the victims and victims' families. You're re-traumatizing them. Sometimes they just can't do it. They can't bring themselves there again. And that's really difficult. And you don't know what kind of information you're going to get from somebody in that position. But if you take some time to look at the person who committed the crime, you might start to add some color to that gray area.
One of the things I've wondered about too is the push toward not naming the shooters and not really going into their background, whether that is having a detrimental effect on our understanding of these shootings for that reason.
100%.
I think also just trying to stray away from anything that has a salacious tone. So it still is respectful to those who are harmed in it. I think what we do with the long form stories is we sit and really dive into it for about a year, rather than, quick hit piece, here are the interesting facts, here, this is what stands out, and this is like a clickbaity story, I guess. Like, it is, what we really strive to do is stay away from anything that really shines a light on that sort of themes, but really gets at the deeper stories that are going on in society and what reflects our belief system and where we're moving as a society.
Wow, you guys, this has been a great conversation. Please let us know what is next for the both of you.
So this was the second mass shooting show that Ellie and I had worked on, and we are developing a third one that we hope will be out in the next 18 months or so. That we're hoping to kind of be the third piece of this trilogy on mass shootings.
Are you going to go into another direction after you finish your trilogy on mass shootings? Because this must be emotionally exhausting to have to do this again.
For me, I can't speak for Ellie, but for me, I think this is the last one. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I don't have ambitions beyond this third one.
All right. You guys, great work. Unbelievable work. It's, like I said in the beginning, it's frightening. It's insightful. There's so many eye-opening moments. So fantastic job to the both of you for this.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for talking about it.